Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Lulu's Perspective. This is a newer channel that I plan on uploading a lot more content to in the coming weeks. But I'm going to start today with critiquing the viewpoints of Ben Shapiro and many of his contemporaries, many other conservative thinkers, about trans people. Now, this issue is fairly important to me, and I think that there are a lot of areas where conservatives get this issue wrong because they present basic biology, they don't go into more advanced biology, and they don't go into neurobiology, they don't go into psychiatry, psychology, any other disciplines which are relevant to this particular issue, and they don't discuss any of the other facts and information about this topic. I am not an expert myself. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a social scientist, but I am perhaps a bit more qualified to discuss this issue when compared to the average layperson, because I have been in the medical field for 5.5 years. I have about 2.5 years experience working in psychiatric hospitals, which of course psychiatry is one of the main disciplines concerning trans people and gender dysphoria. And I am also certified as an emergency medical technician, nationally registered as one. And I also recently became a nationally registered certified medical assistant. And so, having worked in the medical field for 5.5 years and having dealt with a number of trans people, I have relevant experience, knowledge, and education dealing with this particular issue. Now, another reason why I'm probably more qualified to discuss this issue than the average layperson is because I have struggled with gender dysphoria on and off since my teens, and I had some very strong thoughts when I was a prepubescent child of, am I really a boy? You know, what's going on here? Doesn't really seem to make sense. And I chose not to transition for a number of reasons that I'm not going to discuss here because they are personal to me, and there's no point in putting them out there to be critiqued or anything like that. There's just no point in that. But all of these things sort of support the idea that I might be a little bit more qualified to discuss this than the average Joe Blow off the street. Now, just as a little piece of information before I get on to the main points here, I think that there are certain issues where some conservative thinkers like Shapiro hit the nail on the head and have accurate criticisms and viewpoints on certain political issues. However, this is not one of them. If you look at Ben Shapiro's background, he, just like I am not, he is not a social scientist, any other kind of scientist. He's not a doctor or a psychologist or anything of that nature, although his wife is a doctor, and don't you forget that. But what he is a lawyer. He got his political science bachelor's degree from UCLA, and then he went to Harvard Law School. And if you think about it, this makes sense because the idea behind being a lawyer is that no matter whether your client is guilty, not guilty, or with other types of cases that are not criminal, whether they're responsible, not responsible, who's right really doesn't matter from your perspective as a lawyer. That's for the jury to decide. And since he is a lawyer, he is trained by virtue of having become a lawyer to be able to argue for any particular viewpoint. He could probably argue a lot of viewpoints that he opposes better than some people that actually disagree with him on many of these particular issues. And so, because of his training and experience in that regard, he is able to make some very strong arguments for his positions, but the problem is the positions are based on bunk science. First off, one of the problems that you run into is he talks about biological sex as being immutable. And most people who are fairly socially liberal like I am, or even leftist, wouldn't disagree with that. There is only a small minority of people, and granted it is a loud minority, but there is a small minority on the left, people who genuinely think that there is no such thing as biological sex, or gender is completely a social construct and that it has no association with biology. This is really problematic. Liberal people that argue this way shoot themselves in the foot, because if there is no objective reality when it comes to sexes and genders, then the existence of trans people, people that have gender dysphoria and typically medically transition from one sex to the other or transition to be non-binary or at least look different from their birth sex. That invalidates their entire argument about their identity as well as their existence, honestly. So in that particular area, they are absolutely correct to criticize many of those people on the left and other liberals who make that argument, because it's completely nonsensical and it does seem quite crazy at times to make that type of argument. The first problem you run into is that is not how most people who are socially liberal feel about this particular issue. Very few of them actually deny the existence, the objective existence of a tangible, scientifically verifiable gender as well as sex. But conservatives, the way a lot of them talk is as if these types of people who literally argue sex and gender does not exist, it's all made up as a social construct, they argue against a lot of those people as if those people are the majority. Are there a lot of them online on places like TikTok and Tumblr, and are they very obnoxious? Yes, but for most trans people, that is not how they think. In fact, the reason they feel the way they do is because of their biological sex. For example, if you take a male to female transsexual, they don't think that their body is female and that they have XX chromosomes. They know that they have XY chromosomes, and that is the source of their gender dysphoria. They recognize and acknowledge that that is the reality of their body, but they don't like that. That is literally the entire point. If you deny the existence of objective sex, then that makes no sense at all to begin with. If it doesn't exist, then why are you going to be stressed out about it? In fact, many of the conservative people that make these arguments are falling into the same sort of fallacy and logical pitfall that pro-choice people run into when they're arguing against pro-lifers. When pro-lifers say, yeah, okay, I'm pro-life, and then the pro-choicer responds, what about rape? What about incest? What about all of these other things? There is obviously room for discussion on that when it comes to the ethics of abortion, but it's kind of missing the point, because most abortions are entirely as a contraceptive measure to prevent them from having a child, not due to any medical need, not because the pregnancy actually poses a medical risk to them, not because they've been raped, not because of any other extenuating factor like that. It's simply don't want to carry a child to term, don't want to have the child. That's the majority of abortions. Abortions by rape are somewhere between 0.5 and 1.5% of all abortions. And I know that abortions due to a high risk to the mother are somewhere around 5 to 10%, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, same concept. Like, yeah, there's this small minority exception that doesn't fit how the general course of events usually goes, but that's not the point. They're spending too much focus on that. So with that in mind, another area where conservatives fail, and this sort of underlines their entire ideology, is that they argue that separating gender and sex as separate constructs is ascientific and is not logical. For someone to have a gender that is different from sex is something that, in their view, doesn't seem to be congruent, doesn't seem to make sense in light of the scientific evidence. But in fact, what they are asserting is wrong. Are there a lot of trans people that insist that gender as a separate construct from sex is a social construct? Yes, there are, but the thing is, that doesn't actually reflect the truth. That doesn't reflect what science says. Think about it this way. The rhetoric that is typically used is that sex is chromosomal, it is assigned in the womb, and it is immutable. It is not something that you can change once you have already been conceived and you have your own unique DNA and all of your cells have XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes, and gender is defined as something that is going on in the brain that involves a personal sense of identity. So they argue that having a gender as separate from sex seems to be nonsensical, because that seems to define gender in a very, very subjective way, that you can just decide you are whatever you are and nobody can say anything about it. And again, I understand the concern there, but conservatives are still missing the mark on that particular issue. Sex and gender are distinct things, and they are both biological constructs. Gender is not a social construct. There are certain aspects of gender roles and ways that you are expected to dress, behave, so on and so forth, that are socially constructed, but gender as a separate biological construct from sex is not social, it is biological. Now, sex and gender are typically correlated with each other. If you are born one sex, then your gender is typically going to be identifying with that sex, and so there's no problem. But when you run into trans people and other people with gender dysphoria, then you have discontinuity between your gender, what's going on in your brain, and your sex, which is what's going on with your chromosomes and the rest of your body. What they typically argue is, okay, a woman cannot be a man cannot be a woman are women, men are men. Okay, again, we get that. We understand that biological sex is immutable, but gender isn't sex. In fact, there is an extraordinary amount of evidence showing that men's brains and women's brains are quite different, and this is where gender comes from. This is where the construct of feeling male, feeling female, acting in masculine or feminine ways, having a masculine or feminine personality. When it comes to gender, that is largely where gender comes from, and that is supported by a substantial degree of neurobiological research and the field of neurobiology itself. In the description, I'm going to put a link to a body of medical and research-based literature that does discuss the fact that there are differences between men's brains and women's brains. Now, on top of that, because of the fact that there are substantial physical distinction between men's brains and women's brains, when imaging studies have been done of the brains of trans people, it is almost universally shown that the physical composition and makeup of their brain resembles the gender that they identify with, not the sex that they were conceived and born as. Now, the arguments that conservatives make are along the lines of, well, even if you look at those brains, obviously something has to be wrong with the brain if it seems to not have any continuity with the body in which it exists. Obviously something must have gone wrong with the brain because it's rejecting a perfectly functioning and healthy body. And I don't necessarily think at this point that we really know an exact answer to that sort of assertion. I could equally assert that there must be something wrong with the body, and actually it's the brain that was made right, but something went wrong with the body, and the person was actually supposed to be the gender that they identify with. They were supposed to be born as that sex. And at this point, to my knowledge, neither of those hypotheses or theories are really supported by the scientific evidence. There's still a lot more research into neurobiology and psychiatry that have to be done in order to kind of determine how did this happen, what went wrong. There are certain factors that have been identified that play into gender dysphoria, but there's still, like most other disciplines in science, there's a lot more information that has yet to be discovered. When it comes to the whole pronoun thing, that is just an argument that to me is completely unnecessary. Words are tools. Words are meant to communicate certain things from one person to the other. That is the purpose of language, is to have highly sophisticated communication between people, and pronouns are meant to denote the gender or sex of the individual that you are referring to. The problem there is that only using a pronoun to refer to somebody's biological sex kind of goes against the entire idea of language. Language is fluid, language changes to fit certain circumstances. This is something completely different from absurd pronouns people have come up with, absurd neo-pronouns like they want to identify as a bunny, they want to call themselves buns and bun self and things of that nature. There's absolutely no evidence of those identities being rooted in a solid neurological foundation like male and female genders are, and to me that just seems a lot more like role play and pretending more so than something that actually reflects a biological reality. So in that case it is absurd, but language is fluid. Language changes depending on certain things that affect whatever you're talking about. There's certain words that sound the same, have different definitions. You have homonyms. You have a number of different definitions for the same word that can be used in so many different ways. So there is no point in insisting that you have to use the pronoun associated with one's biological sex to refer to them. This is offensive to them, this is hurtful to them, and it doesn't help anything. If I call a trans woman she, that does not mean that I believe she was born a female. I'm using she to refer to her gender, which again has basis in neurobiology, and I'm not using it to refer to her sex. Vice versa with trans men and the pronouns he and she. For example, when it comes to pronouns, we can call a child that has been adopted by two family members, you can call them that child's parents. That doesn't mean they're biological parents, that they were born from those parents, but it does mean that they are functioning in the role of a parent, so they are raising that child and they're functioning as that child's parents. It is the exact same thing when it comes to trans people who were born one sex and transition to live as the other sex, because it is more continuous with their gender identity. And for the vast majority of them, they are not claiming to be the opposite sex. They are claiming that their gender is the opposite of their biological sex. So yes, if we use the whole parent analogy there, same concept. We're not saying trans women are cis women or biological women. We're saying that they are trans women, which is a distinct thing from cis women and biological women. Now, there are abnormalities when it comes to your chromosomes and your biological sex, but those are virtually always abnormalities and deformities. They are medical problems. They are not simply a different way of being. They always talk about wanting to treat gender dysphoria and say, well, that person shouldn't live their life as the opposite sex. We should figure out why they felt that way in the first place and help them get back on track rather than just pretending that they're a man or a woman. And this goes into the whole thing of, they say, well, you can't identify what a woman is or what a man is. And I'm like, we know what men and women are when it comes to sex, when it comes to chromosomes. We also know what men and women are when it comes to the neurobiological construct of gender. When I call someone a trans woman, that is obviously different from calling someone a cis woman. They're both women, different types of women. One was naturally born that way, the other was not, and had to undergo certain changes, hormones, medications, surgeries, etc., to align their body with their gender. This is not an immoral or bad thing. It is simply a procedure to correct something. It's a problem with somebody's body, just like if you were to take a tumor out. Now, when it comes to the whole aspect of the conversation where they say, well, there are people that have body dysmorphia, should we allow them to disfigure their bodies? And the problem you run into there is that it doesn't fit with most other mental disorders like that, body dysmorphia, where you want to cut off a limb, or if you are anorexic and think you are overweight, even when you are very, very skinny and dangerously underweight. The difference is correcting your way of thinking when it comes to a lot of those issues actually does bring relief from the pain and suffering. When it comes to trans people, there is no form of treatment other than transition that has an efficacy rate higher than 0%. Now, transition itself is not foolproof. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There have been many people that have detransitioned and have regretted their decision, and I'm not denying the existence of those people. That would be extraordinarily unkind and rude of me not to acknowledge their existence. But the way I like to think about this is, in medical terminology, if you refer to something as being primary or secondary when related to a disorder, primary means that there is no secondary cause. For example, if you have high blood pressure as a medical condition, there is no secondary cause like another condition. For example, if you're having a heart attack and you have really, really high blood pressure, it's because you're having a heart attack. If you have high blood pressure because it's an inherent condition and you have to take medication on a daily basis to keep your blood pressure down, then that's primary hypertension. Now, a lot of these people who have detransitioned that did seem to have some type of gender dysphoria at one point, where they had some other type of body image issue that detransitioned, a lot of them seem to have what you would almost categorize as being secondary gender dysphoria. The dysphoria is secondary to something else, and if you correct that particular issue, then the dysphoria itself will resolve, and that is what a lot of detransitioners have gone through. It wasn't the right decision for them. There was some other issue that was affecting their gender identity or their body image, and so transition was the really wrong solution, and now they have to live with permanent changes that they can't undo. Now, for other trans people, people that transition and they stay transitioned, they don't go back, they have what I would call primary gender dysphoria. There is no secondary cause of their gender dysphoria that you can correct and their gender dysphoria will resolve. There have been many failed attempts at therapy for trans people. A lot of therapy attempts that are trying to see if there's a secondary issue that's making them uncomfortable with their body, see if there is some other trauma or social aspect that's making them uncomfortable with their body, and it doesn't work. As flimsy as it is, as ineffective as it can be for some people, transition is the only treatment that has a higher efficacy rate than 0%. Something that's often talked about too is the suicide rate of trans people. They're like, well, the suicide rate is still really high after transition, so you can deduce that something else must be going on. The issue is that there are statistics that disagree with those cited statistics. Are there some studies that have looked at some groups of trans people that have shown no change in the suicidality rate? Yes, but there have also been a number of studies that have shown that the suicidality rate decreases substantially after they transition and they are happier with themselves and they fit better into society than they did before. So what you have a lot of conservative people doing is unfortunately grabbing particular statistics, not necessarily looking at the methodology that was used to arrive at that data, and not looking at any of the other statistics or data that seem to contradict theirs, and kind of figuring out why they seem to be contradictory, what factors, what methodologies influence the effects of those studies and the results of those studies. In one of the famous videos of Ben Shapiro, he sort of uses this logic of, why are you 23 instead of, a much older age? And then in the same video, another guy that comes up to ask a question, says like, okay, you're opining on sociological issues, but you're not a sociologist or any kind of expert on this thing. And he said, well, I don't think that sociology is a particularly expert field, and I don't need a graduate degree in sociology to know BS when I hear it. Of course, he follows this up with saying, I've read the studies about these particular things and I can have an opinion on it. Now, the thing is, again, he's a lawyer. His idea is he can argue for any position by looking at the facts and trying to spin them in a way that's favorable for his viewpoint. And to say that sociology is not an expert field, there are a lot of very, very complex things in sociology as well as psychology, and there's a reason why you can get a doctorate degree in sociology, and there's a reason why being a sociologist is actually a distinct discipline. This isn't just supported by sociologists. This is by and large supported by the scientific consensus of psychologists, medical doctors, psychiatrists. This isn't just a very wavy, unsure thing that there can be multiple opinions on that might be equally as valid when more research comes out. This is actually a very, very well-defined and well-understood phenomenon when it comes to treating gender dysphoria. People will say, well, citing the scientific consensus is just an argument from authority. The reason why the scientific consensus can by and large be trusted is because how the scientific consensus comes to be. It is many scientists in a particular field all around the world doing research, doing studies, doing experiments on this particular thing over and over and over and over again, and peer reviewing each other's research to figure out what the truth is, what the evidence actually supports. That is how something becomes a scientific consensus, is essentially by a trial by fire. You do all types of testing, all types of factual analysis until you can figure out what the facts are. And in this case, many of the facts on trans people and gender dysphoria are very, very well established, and they have been studied ad nauseum by many researchers in many different parts of the world. And again, I'm going to attach the research and data regarding that in the description. When it comes to much of the actual morality of transitioning, because there are religions that object to it, that say that you should live your life as your birth sex and so on and so forth. That is a completely different argument from what I'm discussing here. I have alluded to morality a little bit before, but there is a lot going on when it comes to the moral side of it, the ethical side of it, philosophical side of it. That is another discussion for another day, but what I'm discussing here is purely just what we know from science. Now, when it comes to trans people in sports, this is an area that for me is a little bit rocky. The data when it comes to trans people in sports is not 100% solidified in one direction or the other on this particular issue. The argument that conservatives make is that trans women were born males, went through male puberty, most of them went through male puberty, and that it therefore creates an unfair advantage for them if they participate in women's sports. They don't extend this to trans men because obviously transition and they have the same physical strength, endurance, so on and so forth that biological men have, and so you don't run into the same problem of there supposedly being an unfair advantage. What conservatives ignore, however, is that many of the studies when it comes to trans women in sports is that when they go through a medical transition, they're on female hormones and they are on testosterone blockers so that they have as much testosterone in their body as a biological female does. Their advantage in sports actually drops substantially. There's just more to consider when it comes to the issue of sports than what type of puberty someone went through and the results of that, whether it be height, shoulder width, bone density, so on and so forth. Someone's performance in sports and physical ability isn't just due to the sex you were born as and the effects of adolescence. It is also affected by actually maintaining your testosterone levels and your levels of other hormones that are associated with your biological sex. So again, the research on this can be a little bit rocky. Now, there are some studies that have shown that somebody's advantage by having gone through male puberty seems to dissipate entirely, and there are others that have indicated that it drops somewhat, but that there's still an unfair advantage. Now, if you take Lia Thomas, for example, that's one athlete that a lot of people have been freaking out about lately. And if you look at her statistics and performance before and after transition, when she was still competing as a man, she was an elite swimmer. She was very, very highly ranked in the men's division. And when she transitioned to female, a lot of her times when it came to swimming events dropped by 15 or 20 seconds. And there are a number of female swimmers who have actually beaten her in different events, so it's not like she's completely crushing all the competition and always winning. Yeah, she's doing very, very well, but she was also doing really well when she was a swimmer in the men's division. 15 to 20 seconds is a lot to lose in competitive swimming. There are swimmers who have set records by milliseconds. There are swimmers that have won competitions by a matter of milliseconds. So for transition to have dropped your times 15 to 20 seconds for a lot of the events that you compete in, that is a huge drop. This is not a black and white area. I think, as I said, that the data on this particular issue is mixed and that there needs to be a bit more research on do biological males transitioning to female, transitioning to trans women, do they have an unfair advantage still? What are the factors that give them that advantage other than hormones? Because obviously the hormone levels change and they're not really a concern at that point. And does this disparity, unfair advantage, does it always exist in trans female athletes who've gone through male puberty? Does it not? If so, why is it there in some athletes and not in others? There's just a lot of factors that are considered, and it's not like a monolithic thing of, oh, trans women always have an unfair advantage and cis women are going to be defeated by them. When it comes to the trans bathroom and trans locker room issue, I get that because the reason why restrooms and locker rooms and things like that are segregated in the first place is because undressing and taking care of personal and intimate needs around somebody of the opposite sex is typically uncomfortable to most people. So I can understand why there are a lot of people out there. There's somebody, if you're a woman, a cis woman and a trans woman walks in the restroom and they look like a man to you, they got male jewelry, if you will, hanging out there, then yeah, I can understand why that would make a woman really, really uncomfortable. But There are plenty of trans women out there who pass, and because of the fact that they pass, there's no way to enforce a law saying that, oh, they must go in the bathroom with their birth sex even if they've had all the surgeries and they look like a woman, and you really wouldn't be able to differentiate it unless you looked at their chromosomes from some skin cells or something along those lines. You're going to put a trans woman who looks like a woman in the men's bathroom, or you're going to take a trans man who looks like a man and put him in the women's bathroom. That's going to cause all kinds of problems. For trans people to go in restrooms and be predatory, that's almost non-existent. That's very, very rare. And you also have cases of cis men who go into men's restroom and assault boys, and there are also cis men that go into women's restroom and try to record and assault girls. So this whole idea of, oh, trans people in restrooms, it's a big deal, is just nonsense. Before any of this was ever a controversy, trans people were going into the restroom of their choice, and because of the fact that they pass, that they put effort into their appearance, looking and sounding like the way that they would like to be perceived, there was no issue. So anyway, that's all I have to say for now, and I hope that you found this to be constructive. If you agree, if you disagree, you're feel free to leave comments, but all I would ask is that you be reasonably respectful. There's no point in being a jerk. We can disagree on certain issues and still have a reasonable conversation. Thank you.